Hello, folks. Thank you for tuning in to the Federalist Files. On today's show, we will be going over Federalist number 55. It is titled The Total Number of the House Representatives, written by James Madison, February 13th, 1788. Topics include Madison answering contentions that persist in relation to the low number of representatives. There will be a census and reevaluation for number of representatives every 10 years. So this is an introduction to how the census is to work every single 10 years. He lays it out here. And the apportionment at this time was you get every one House member for every single 30,000 citizens. I think he even mentions it in this paper. So we're going to go over that. But just to state what it currently is, I actually had to really look through this. I started the podcast and then I had to go through. And it's actually very difficult to find, which is very odd. But here I have an article, and they're saying there was this act in 1929 to keep the members at 435 House members. That's what we currently have. We've had it like that since 1929. And it says for every other in the century, one for every 747,000 I have here. And at first, originally, it was one for every 209,000 at that time. So obviously, our population has expanded pretty rapidly, I guess, within the last 100 years. But I just think that's interesting to mention. So we're going to go on. So in this paper, Madison, he responds to critics whose contention is impertinence to the amount of representatives existing as too small. They will be ignorant to interests, and they will not properly represent the citizens. So that is the Dissenters' opinion. So he states all of the objectors, what their claims are through here. I think there's 4 different claims that he states. He states, and I quote, "So small a number of representatives will be an unsafe depositary of the public interests. Secondly, that they will not possess a proper knowledge of the local circumstances of their numerous constituents. Thirdly, that they will take from that class of citizens which will sympathize least with the feelings of the mass of the people, and be most likely to aim at a permanent elevation of the few on the depression of the many. Fourthly, that defective as the number will be in the first instance, it will be more and more disproportionate by the increase of the people, and the obstacles which will prevent a correspondent increase of the representatives." End quote. So he goes on to explain and kind of dismantle these arguments. So in relation to the number of representatives, Madison, he cites every state in the Union as a reference in which their representation is capricious. It's all over the place, to say the least. So he starts off, because he explains one state, and the 2 states have the same population, but then one state has 300 representatives, and then the other state only has 100. So he's going to go through every single one. He states, and I quote, "Passing over the difference between the smallest and largest states, as Delaware, whose most numerous branch consists of 21 representatives, and Massachusetts, where it amounts to between 300 and 400, a very considerable difference is observable among states nearly equal in population. The number of representatives in Pennsylvania is not more than 1/5 of that in the state last mentioned. New York, whose population is to that of South Carolina as 6 to 5, has little more than 1/3 of the number of representatives. As great a disparity prevails between the states of Georgia and Delaware or Rhode Island. In Pennsylvania, the representatives do not bear a greater proportion to their constituents than of 1 for every 400 or 500. In Rhode Island, they bear a proportion of at least 1 for every 1,000. And according to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 to every 10 electors, and must unavoidably far exceed the proportion in any of the other states." End quote. So these states are all individual states. They had their state governments. They were of the Republican character for the most part, and they all ran it completely differently. It was, you could have 2 different. I think the one that he mentions, the most notable one, is that New York is South Carolina, and New York has about 5 times the population of South Carolina, and it has a little more than 1/3. So New York, they had no representatives for their high population, and South Carolina had too many representatives for their population. Essentially, is what he's saying. So that's him just knocking down the very first argument, saying, yeah, well, as long as really in this entire paper he goes through with the idea of, yeah, you can have a very numerous house. A numerous house. The thing that you really don't want is a house that has absolutely no one in it, because then they hold too much political power. But you don't want too numerous of a house. So he goes on. He states next, and I quote, another general remark to be made is that the ratio between the representatives and the people ought not to be the same where the latter are very numerous as where they are very few. Were the representatives in Virginia to be regulated by the standard in Rhode Island, they would at this time amount to between 400 and 520 or 30 years to 1,000. On the other hand, the ratio of Pennsylvania, if applied to the state of Delaware, would reduce the representative assembly of the latter to 7 or 8 members. Nothing can be more fallacious than to found our political calculations on arithmetical principles, end quote, which I think is very interesting. So we say the math should not really, we shouldn't be sitting here worried about the math, how the math plays out. We, moreover, should be worried about the political axioms. That should be our main concern. The philosophical axioms as well is what should matter much more than just math. If we say, okay, well, this state has it this way, this state has it the other way, we're going to meet somewhere in the middle, or we're going to do it this way, or we're going to do it the other way. They shouldn't be looking at the math to determine this. It should be what the people want, really, at the end of the day. So he continues, he states next, and I quote, 60 or 70 men may be more properly trusted with a given degree of power than 6 or 7, but it does not follow that 600 or 700 would be proportionably a better depositary. And if we carry on the supposition to 6,000 or 7,000, the whole reasoning ought to be reversed. The truth is that in all cases a certain number at least seems to be necessary to secure the benefits of free consultation and discussion, and to guard against too easy a combination for improper purposes, as on the other hand the number ought at most to be kept within a certain limit in order to avoid the confusion and intemperance of a multitude, end quote. So he's saying the bigger, the larger you make it, you're going to have a lot of confusion, intemperance, meaning that there's going to be a lot of fighting, too much infighting. There's going to be a lot of side taking. I think it'll get more and more political the more members you have. I think that's what he's trying to say. And it would be really confusing if we had in, like the state of New Jersey, for example, if our state legislature had 800 people running it, it would be, to begin with, it would also be a huge burden on the taxpayer because you have to pay those people to follow through with the position. That would be a problem, obviously. And he says at the same time, though, you don't want all that power to be given to 5 or 6 people, which is reasonable. You don't want the key to Republican governance is the power is supposed to be in the people's hands and also delegated quite equally amongst different branches and decentralized as much as possible. So he goes on. Next, he states, and I quote, "It is necessary also to recollect here the observations which were applied to the case of biennial elections for the same reason that the limited powers of the Congress and the control of the state legislatures justify less frequent elections than the public safely might otherwise require. The members of the Congress need be less numerous than if they possessed the whole power of legislation and were under no other than the ordinary restraints of other legislative bodies," end quote. So, most importantly, he says, yes, this is the point of the biennial elections, this is the point of having the 2-year elections so that the representatives of the House don't become too powerful, and that's the reason, hence the reasoning for the biennial elections. And it's a threat. It ends up becoming a threat to the public safety, having that many people. And the reasoning for the fact that it can be so numerous is really what he's saying, is because every single 2 years they have an election. If it was like it is in the Senate, every single 6 years they can go with less members, because then it's going to get less contentious. That's his point behind that. And it gives them restraints. That is a restraint on that legislative body. But the 2-year elections is really what holds the House of Representatives accountable. Madison, he continues to answer to the objection in terms of the number of representatives his dissenters state, and I quote, "So small a number cannot be safely trusted with so much power," end quote. So now you're hearing his his dissenters are talking about actually how it's too small. And I think he goes on to actually explain a very interesting element to why it's not too small. And then he explains as well at the very end of this paper how some of these guys are really fueled by rage and jealousy. And that's probably the most important part of, I mean, this part's important as well, but at the very end of the paper, I think there's a good theme to be taken from that, just on the scope of government in a general sense. So Madison, he establishes the proportionality of representatives being one for every 30,000 inhabitants, starting with 65 members, and will conduct a census every 10 years to increase the number of members. Disclosure, the current proportion is not the same, which I mentioned before. It's something like 700,000 per every single representative. Madison estimates that in 25 years, the number will be 200 representatives. So this is why, because in the beginning, we don't have enough representatives. He says, well, don't worry about it. In 25 years, we're going to have 200 representatives. And then I think he says something like in 10 years, we'll even have more than that. And importantly, as well to mention from this, it's as soon as this Constitution's passed, it's going to be 65, right? Then they're going to do a quick one-time census within 3 years. So once 3 years pass, then they go ahead with another census, right? They're going to add on there. And then from there on out, it's 10 years. And we still run it that way today. So we just had recently the 2020 census, which I don't think they've gotten the results from that one yet, because I think they were trying to hold it up for COVID reasons. And then they were trying to also additionally count illegal aliens on the census. I think they did that in New Jersey in particular, actually. So he goes on next, and I quote, "It is said in the first place that so small a number cannot be safely trusted with so much power, the number of which this branch of the legislature is to consist at the outset of the government will be 65. Within 3 years, a census is to be taken where the number may be augmented to one for every 30,000 inhabitants. And within every successive period of 10 years, the census is to be renewed, and augmentations may continue to be made under the above limitation. It will not be thought an extravagant conjecture that the first census will, at the rate of one for every 30,000, raise the number of representatives to at least 100. So he's saying on the very first census, so he's saying alone in 10 years, we're going to have at least 100 representatives in the House. So it's really not something that we need to worry about, especially since we are now in the infancy of our country, or we will be in the infancy of our country. So he goes on to explain even further. He states, and I quote, "Estimating the Negroes in the proportion of 3/5, it can scarcely be doubted that the population of the United States will by that time, if it does not already, amount to 3 millions. At the expiration of 25 years, according to the computed rate of increase, the number of representatives will amount to 200, and of 50 years to 400. This is a number which I presume will put an end to all fears arising from the smallness of the body. I take for granted here what I shall, in answering the fourth objection, hereafter show, that the number of representatives will be augmented from time to time in the manner provided by the Constitution." End quote. And this is still something that we follow today, this provision. We still conduct a census every single 10 years. Now, do we apportion it for every single 30,000 members? No, we don't do that. We change around the apportionment, but the number 435 representatives has been the same since 1929. From that act that they passed. Some important thing to point out, he says at the expiration of 25 years, according to the computed rate of increase, he's saying that they're going to have, within 25 years, like I said, 200 at least, and 50 years it'll be 400. So that pretty much throws that objection completely out. So he goes on. In other words, the proportion of representatives to citizens will be reevaluated from time to time. That's something that he mentions. Next, Madison takes to task whether this temporary regulation in reference to the number of representatives is dangerous to the public liberty. So this is the contrary supposition. He states, and I quote, "On a contrary supposition, I should admit the objection to have very great weight indeed. The true question to be decided then is whether the smallness of the number as a temporary regulation be dangerous to the public liberty, whether 65 members for a few years, and 100 or 200 for a few more, be a safe depositary for a limited and well-guarded power of legislating for the United States, end quote. So he's asking the question, is this actually something that we should be worried about for the public liberty? So he goes on, and this is what his answer is, should the people really be worried about this? And I don't know if it actually still does apply today, but I think he hits the nail on the head here. He states, and I quote, "With regard to the present genius of the people of America, the spirit which actuates the state legislatures, and the principles which are incorporated with the political character of every class of citizens, I am unable to conceive that the people of America, in their present temper, or under any circumstances which can speedily happen, will choose in every second year repeat the choice of 65 or 100 men who would be disposed to form and pursue a scheme of tyranny or treachery. I am unable to conceive that the state legislatures, which must feel so many motives to watch, and which possess so many means of counteracting the federal legislature, would fail either to detect or to defeat a conspiracy of the latter against the liberties of their common constituents." End quote. This is a profound statement. And the best part of this statement is where he says, I think it's where he says, "I am unable to conceive that the people of America, in their present temper," and that's the point that I wanted to point out. So what he's saying, the people of America, as well as the state legislatures, which represent the citizens the most closely in terms of any government, they are the closest representatives of the people, the state legislatures themselves. He says, the people in their current temper would never let this happen. They would never elect every single 2 years people that want to commit tyranny and treachery upon them. And I like that he says in their present temper, because currently that's not the case. Currently the people here are open in this current period. They're open to tyranny and treachery being committed upon them, almost blindly following the faith of politicians. So next he goes on, he continues this. "Madison believed that no man capable of recommending themselves as the choice of the people would attempt to betray them in the short term of 2 years in office. He predicts, and I quote, "I am equally unable to conceive that there are at this time, or can be in any short time in the United States, any 65 or 100 people capable, or 100 men capable of recommending themselves to the choice of the people at large, who would either desire or dare within the short space of 2 years to betray the solemn trust committed to them. What change of circumstance, time, and a fuller population of our country may produce requires a prophetic spirit to declare, which makes no part of my pretensions. But judging from the circumstances now before us, and from the probable state of them within a moderate period of time, I must pronounce that the liberties of America cannot be unsafe in the number of hands proposed by the federal Constitution." End quote. I just like all these pretexts that he has, and all these statements where he says, well, under our current spirit, this is not going to happen. He said, I cannot tell the future. I don't know if that is going to be the case in the future, if the people of this country are going to have the same feelings and the same spirit as we currently have, a yearning for freedom. Which he's right, because this is just not the truth. He's saying, I don't think there are 65 or even 100 men that are capable of getting the people to vote for them and then following through with despotic tyranny in result of their election victory. He says, I don't think that meaning that he is betting on the intelligence of the people themselves. There's no one that's going to hoodwink the people. They're not smart enough. No one's smart enough to outclass and hoodwink the people in that current state. He had a lot of confidence in the people. That is currently not the case. The people are idiots. The people now have no idea what's going on. They pay attention to the Kardashians. They pay attention to whatever's going on in pop culture, and then they go and vote whoever the DNC tells them, or whoever their favorite celebrity tells them to vote for. They have no opinions of their own. They're brainwashed, and they're being streamlined, fed a bunch of garbage from the media. That's currently what goes on in our political class. It's so disappointing, because today I watched, and as always, I pre-record the Federalist paper podcasts. So just today, Joe Biden has very first press conference, very first presser. And I see highlights. I haven't watched the whole thing. I don't really think it's even going to be worth me watching the whole thing. Maybe I will when I'm done with this podcast now, just to kind of get a little background, because I'm going to have to report. I'll have to report about it in the current events. I've seen highlights, and I don't really want to. I'd rather call them lowlights, because they're terrible. Joe Biden is cognitively declining. He is compromised, and he has no idea where he is. He said that he was in Congress. He's been in Congress for 120 years, or 120 years ago is when he first got into Congress. In the middle of sentences talking about, I don't even remember what he was talking about, but he's in the middle of the sentence, he stops the sentence and just goes on to a different topic because he legitimately forgets what he's talking about. This dude is so compromised, and we have, I would beg to differ, 50% of the country voted for this guy. So we have people that voted for him not knowing, and there's been all these statistics, all these studies. They didn't know about Hunter Biden. They didn't know about any of the racist stuff with Joe Biden in his history. They don't know about Joe Biden sniffing hair, being creepy with little kids and women. They don't know about any of that. None of that information was given to them by the mainstream media because the media has just suppressed all the stories about Joe Biden. And now he comes on national television, in our pathetic media class, they praise him and they condone his stumbling all over himself, and they go out and they extol him. I've seen Ted Lieu comes out, not that he's from the media, but then there's the media. There's these certain Twitter accounts that I follow. It's like liberals posting their L's is the name of the Twitter. It's hilarious. It'll be the statuses of some of the liberals in the media class saying that Joe Biden was so highly competent and really is just a scholar. Things like that. Just really licking the boot of the government. It's unbelievable what they do, but it's just this just does not ring true to today. The people are probably the least informed that they have ever been in the history of the United States, unfortunately. We have a complicit media, and that's really what the problem is at the end of the day. We have a complicit media, and then we have an education system which exalts just critical race theory, exalts hating America. All of that is what is being glorified currently, and we need to change it, or the country is going to end. It'll be futile. It'll end. It's not gonna be good. That's all I'm gonna say about it. So, in support of Madison's argument, he explains the Continental Congress's organization. So he's saying we have such a small body. You're saying this is a problem. In the future, we're going to have a larger body. And you're saying because there's such a small body, it's going to be a problem. So he goes on. He explains the Continental Congress. So this is the Revolutionary Army's Congress. He states, and I quote, "The Congress which conducted us through the Revolution was a less numerous body than their successors will be. They were not chosen by, nor responsible to, their fellow citizens at large. Though appointed from year to year and recallable at pleasure, they were generally continued for 3 years and prior to the ratification of the federal articles for a still longer term." End quote. So he's saying there was no security to our Continental Congress. They were not really accountable to the will of the people themselves. They were not responsible because they were kind of undercover. They were appointed year to year, and they were appointed. They weren't voted. They weren't elected. And still, they did what they were supposed to do, and they did not attempt to take liberties. And I think that just goes to much more of the class of citizen at that time, and the thought process and the ideology of those of the founders, and the yearning for liberty, which is just almost extinct in our current climate. Madison details they were in charge of foreign affairs, held longer terms, and worked under a veil of secrecy. So he states next, and I quote, "Through the whole course of the war, they had the fate of their country more in their hands than it is to be hoped will ever be the case with our future representatives." End quote. So you say that's very interesting. So is to be hoped with our future representatives. They had the whole course of the war. They had the fate of the country in their hands. Which in the future, meaning he thinks himself, they actually had too much power, and we hope that in the future our representatives do not hold that much power over the people, which just unfortunately once again is not the case now. This excerpt entails the philosophy of the authors that self-government was significant and that the power is to be held primarily by the people rather than their representatives. Is exactly what he's saying. He's saying that the people themselves should be holding the power. It is good what these. He's not knocking what the Continental Congress did, but he's saying hopefully in the future we won't have to rely on our representatives. We won't have to rely on the government. We will be able to rely on ourselves for self-government. So Madison, he concludes this paper by detailing another safeguard for the people from the position of the representatives. He states, and I quote, "The members of the Congress are rendered ineligible to any civil office that may be created or of which the emoluments may be increased during the term of their election." He continues, "Their private fortunes, as they must all be American citizens, cannot possibly be sources of danger." End quote. So he's talking about in particular how some of these, and this is the important part that I was stating to end, that was going to end the paper. He's saying we should not be worried about their personal fortunes. That is not to be what's worried about. We'll set it up so the emolument they can't hold any other office or accept any other emoluments or any other money. So in summation, Madison does not fear the fortunes made by officials while they were private citizens. See, this is the important part that we need to differentiate here. And while in office, representatives cannot compound their power by holding another office and cannot have their salaries increased during the term, to safeguard representatives is corruption. So this is what the politicians, they love to do. They love to get on stage and point, oh, well, this guy made this much money. This guy, you can't trust him. You can't vote for him because he's a millionaire. And well, my answer is, if this guy made money in the private industry, we should not be. That is not a net negative. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. People were hired. People got jobs. People made money that worked under them. They were able to feed their families. They got good health care for their kids. This person provided other people with a living. What we really should be looking at, we should be much more concerned with, is the politicians that have made millions of dollars while in office, because they're not supposed to be accepting any other emoluments. So how is it that they were able to achieve this wealth over these years while they were in the Congress when they're supposed to be diligently working for the people? That is the real question to be answered. And I'm sick of the politicians doing this, and I'm really sick of politicians that make money and try to get into politics and run, and they get knocked for it and they get condemned for it and they don't stand up for themselves. John Delaney had this, and the Democrat, because I watched all the Democrat debates, John Delaney had this and then agreed that he needs to pay more money, and he pretty much he cowtailed and he genuflected and he capitulated. Unfortunately, he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have backed down. He should have said, yeah, you're going to knock me because I'm a successful business owner and I helped hundreds of people feed their families and gave hundreds of people jobs, and hundreds of people relied on me on a regular day basis. How many people actually rely on you as the senator of the, as the senator of, I think it's Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren? How many people actually relied on you, Kamala Harris, as the senator of California, where you were locking people up as the AG and holding them in prison for longer terms for slave labor, essentially? That's really what the answer shouldn't have been. The answer shouldn't have been, oh, I'm willing to. You shouldn't capitulate to this crap. That's really what it is. We need politicians up there now at this point. And the more and more I follow, the more and more podcasts I do, it's depressing. It's also fascinating, and it's also infuriating that we have these people that go up there and they do the same dance over and over again, and no one's realistic. No one just speaks realistically like a normal American would. It's all optics, and once we get a guy that goes in there and does that, then it's a giant problem. And these people are not relatable at all. They're almost like robots. They're robotic. They get told by their focus groups what to say, how to conduct themselves. So in much more verbose terms, Madison concludes that those who think representatives' influence can be purchased through emoluments are mistaken and driven by unbounded jealousy. So, this is very important what he says here. He states, and I quote, "No offices therefore can be dealt out to the existing members but such as may become vacant by ordinary casualties, and to suppose that these would be sufficient to purchase the guardians of the people, selected by the people themselves, is to renounce every rule by which events ought to be calculated, and to substitute an indiscriminate and unbounded jealousy with which all reasoning must be vain, end quote. So he's saying the people in their offices, especially if they have money, there's no other power that they really have other than selecting new members if there was a death. And I'm pretty sure the House of Representatives, I don't know, I think they do have that power, actually. I think the senators are to be selected. I know the senators, if a senator passes like a John McCain situation, or they leave their office, then the governor of that state can pick and select who the next senator is to be, and then obviously they still have to win re-election. Or election, since they were never technically elected. But I guess in the House of Representatives, it's the same case. If somebody drops out, then they would have to vote in whoever the House of Representative. I guess they're in charge of that, and they're saying that's the only power they have. And the amount of money that they have cannot purchase their position, is what he's saying. So he goes on. This is the very last quote, and this is the most substantial one from this philosophy. He states, and I quote, "The sincere friends of liberty who give themselves up to the extravagancies of this passion are not aware of the injury they do their own cause, as there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another." So what he's getting at here, and it's so self-evident in real life, even now, you have a bunch of people. And he says that people that talk about liberty, but then at the same time knock somebody or they're jealous of somebody else because they have money. He goes, these are people that are straight up jealous. And it's for their own reasoning. It's to justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence in themselves. It's a quality of human nature, is what he's saying. This is honest to today. This is when you see someone make a lot of money, everyone complains how they should be taxed higher, and they should be, pretty much the money should be redistributed. It's actually more pathetic now, and it's more groveling because people want redistribution. They want the government to take a gun, put it to somebody's head, and say, hey, give me this much money, and then redistribute it to you, which is kind of pathetic. It's emasculating, rather. He says this is a problem. This is not a free country. There's no liberty in that. Because then there's no that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government. If that is the case, if that's the philosophy, then we don't have the virtue for self-government. We could never run it that way. We would have to put the chains of despotism on everybody to restrain them from destroying and devouring one another, if that's the case. If that's the way that people feel, then we'll have complete anarchy, and then we'll need like a king monarch that shuts everybody down, if that's the case. If that was which I don't think it necessarily is a countrywide thing. If it was a country consensus-wide thing, then we would be having a civil war on our hands, or people would be killing each other for, money or what have you, or for the riches out of jealousy. And he says that ideology, it's almost like critical race theory. It's almost like communism, honestly. That ideology, that thought process, that philosophy is toxic. It's poisonous. It is cancerous to a society, and it will lead us to an anarchy or rather a monarch, authoritarian leader to shut all of that down. So I think that's a very important, prominent quote there. So that'll be it for this one. I greatly appreciate everyone for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe, drop the mic on people, let them know about the podcast. Once again, I cannot advertise. I've actually yet to check out if I can. Maybe I can through Facebook, but I've yet to check it out. So I greatly appreciate everyone tuning in. I will see you all next time. Thank you.